In the heart of the Wild West, a lonely rancher met an Apache girl who whispered, "I can't live without a man." What followed defied gossip and fear, becoming a love story stronger than bullets or storms. Subscribe, like, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get started. The prairie stretched endlessly, a sea of grass bending under the evening wind. John Mallory, a rancher hardened by years of loss, rode slowly toward his cabin. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire, but his heart carried only shadows. His wife had died 3 winters past, leaving him with nothing but land, cattle, and silence. Nights were long, mornings longer, and though he never spoke it, loneliness hung heavier than any saddle. He had buried his laughter in the soil along with her, and every day since, the ranch had felt like a prison of empty echoes. That evening, as his boots struck the dust, John noticed something unusual, a figure by his gate. At first, he thought it a trick of light, the wind shaping grass into human form. But as he drew closer, his chest tightened. A young woman stood barefoot, her dark hair tangled from travel, her dress torn but her posture unbroken. Apache by her features, no more than 25. Her eyes flickered like embers, a mix of fear and unyielding strength. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled yet carried fire. "I can't live without a man. Let me stay." The words cut through the air sharper than any blade. John froze, his hand resting instinctively on the worn leather of his belt. He had heard stories of women fleeing raids, of tribes scattered, of captives wandering into ranches seeking food or safety. But this was different. She did not beg for pity or coin. Her words were raw, desperate, yet heavy with dignity. She did not plead to survive. She demanded belonging. And for a man who had lived too long in silence, those words stirred something buried deep in his chest. He studied her, uncertain, the weight of the decision pressing down like the sky itself. Allowing her inside would mean gossip, whispers, and judgment from neighbors who already looked at him as half mad for living alone. But to turn her away, to send her barefoot back into the wilderness, was a cruelty he could not stomach. With a slow nod, John stepped aside, his rough voice breaking the tension. "You'd best come in. Nights aren't kind out here." She moved past him, quiet but steady, carrying herself like a queen stripped of her crown, yet unwilling to bow. Inside the cabin, firelight cast long shadows against the log walls. John set bread and water on the table, the simple offerings of a lonely man unused to guests. She sat carefully, her back straight, her eyes never leaving his. When she finally spoke again, her tone was low but unwavering. "My name is Aylin," he repeated it, tasting the syllables, foreign yet beautiful. She did not tell her whole story that night, nor did he ask. The silence between them was not empty. It was alive, filled with unspoken truths neither dared to voice. Days bled into one another, and slowly the ranch began to change. Aylin woke before dawn, gathering wood, feeding chickens, and tending to tasks without being asked. John watched quietly, unsure what to make of her strength. She was not fragile, nor was she meek. She worked as though the land itself ran in her veins, and when she moved through the cabin, it felt less hollow, less haunted. For the first time in years, John found himself returning from the fields, eager to hear her footsteps, the soft hum of her voice drifting like music through the air. Still, doubts haunted him. He wondered if she had family searching for her, if men from her tribe would come knocking at his door, demanding answers. He wondered if she had chosen him, or if the frontier's cruelty had left her no choice at all. At night, he lay awake, listening to the crackle of the fire, her breathing steady on the other side of the room. The line between kindness and possession blurred in his mind. He had not bought her nor claimed her, but she was here, and in some strange way, she was his. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, thunder rumbling like the earth itself had grown restless. Aylin stood at the doorway, her eyes fixed on the horizon, unafraid of the lightning tearing open the sky. John came to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. She turned to him then, her gaze steady, and for the first time her hand brushed his. "I do not belong to you," she whispered, her voice like the wind. "But I choose to stay." The words struck him harder than any storm, breaking walls he thought unbreakable. From that night onward, their silence was no longer heavy but alive with promise. Aelin taught him words from her tongue, soft syllables that rolled like rivers, and he shared with her the old songs his mother used to sing. When neighbors rode past, sneering, their voices dripping with mockery, Jon stood tall. He no longer cared for their judgment. Let them laugh, let them whisper. He had something they could never understand. Aelin was not a burden nor a secret. She was the spark that lit his world again, the fire that burned away years of cold emptiness. And so the ranch, once little more than dirt and cattle, grew alive with something new. Jon found himself laughing at her teasing, smiling at her quiet strength, and listening to her stories long into the night. He had once thought his life would end in silence, his days swallowed by work and grief. But Aelin's presence reminded him that love was not always gentle nor planned. Sometimes it arrived barefoot at your gate, trembling yet defiant, asking for nothing but a chance. And in that chance, Jon Mallory discovered the one thing he had thought forever lost: hope. Days slid into weeks, the rhythm of the ranch settling into something new. Where once Jon Mallory had worked alone, Aelin now moved beside him. She hauled water from the creek, her arms steady, her steps sure. She mended fences, gathered eggs, and even helped calm the cattle when storms rattled them at night. He often watched in quiet awe, realizing she was not fragile but forged of steel and fire. In her presence, his lonely days no longer stretched endless. They were filled with motion, sound, and a sense of belonging he thought he would never feel again. The townsfolk, however, had no kindness for such an arrangement. When Jon rode into town for supplies, whispers trailed him like shadows. Men smirked at the saloon. Women scoffed outside the general store. "Bought himself a squaw," they muttered, their voices dipped in venom. "Can't get a decent woman, so he picked one off the prairie." But Jon, who once might have lowered his head, now stood taller. He had no shame in Aelin's presence. She was no possession. She was his choice, and she had chosen him. That was a bond no gossip could ever break. At night, when chores were done and cattle penned safe, they sat by the fire. Aelin hummed low songs in her tongue, melodies like rivers moving through stone. Jon listened, letting the music soak through his tired bones. Sometimes she taught him words, patient and soft, correcting his rough accent with laughter that warmed the cabin. In return, he told her stories of his youth, of his father teaching him to ride, of the first calf he ever roped. Their voices mingled with the crackle of firewood, stitching together two worlds, once torn apart by fear. Storms swept across the plains that spring, fierce and merciless. Thunder cracked like rifles. Rain turned the earth to rivers, and lightning split the black sky. Jon braced for the fear that storms usually brought, but Aelin's hand slipped into his, steady and warm. She did not flinch at the roar of thunder, nor shrink from the flashes of fire above. Instead, she watched the storm as though it were an old friend, her gaze fearless. "The sky is alive," she whispered. "It speaks." That night, Jon realized she carried not only strength, but a wisdom older than the land itself. One evening, under a vault of endless stars, they stepped outside the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. Aelin tilted her face upward, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the heavens. Jon stood beside her, silent, his heart aching with words he had never dared to speak. Then softly she turned to him. "I will never leave," she said, her voice steady as the prairie wind. The weight of her vow filled the night, more binding than any law. In that moment, Jon knew he was no longer alone in the world. Their bond deepened with each passing season. Together they planted a small garden behind the cabin. Beans, corn, squash. Aelin tended it with care, singing as seeds pushed through soil. When the first shoots rose, Jon felt a strange swelling in his chest, as if life itself had chosen to return to his land. Each green sprout was a promise of tomorrow, a reminder that loss did not have the final word. And when Aylin laughed, crouched in the dirt with her hands stained by earth, he thought it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Not all days were easy. There were times when old wounds surfaced, his grief, her past. Some nights Aylin woke from dreams with tears on her cheeks, her body trembling. John never pressed her for details. Instead, he sat close, offering the only thing he could, his steady presence. "You're safe here," he whispered, his voice rough but true. And when he, too, felt the weight of loneliness creep in, Aylin would rest her hand on his chest, her touch grounding him. In their shared silence they healed, not as master and servant, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals. One afternoon, a group of men rode up the ranch fence, neighbors, hard-eyed and cruel with words. "She ain't your kind, Mallory," one spat. "Send her back where she belongs." John's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, Aylin stepped forward. Her chin lifted, her voice clear. "I belong where I choose." The men sneered, muttered, and rode off, dust trailing behind. John looked at her then, pride swelling in his chest. She was not afraid to face the world that despised her. And in that courage, he found the strength to stand taller beside her, unshaken by any man's scorn. As summer ripened, the ranch thrived. Cattle grew strong, the garden flourished, and laughter returned to the land. Neighbors who once mocked began to watch quietly, puzzled by the transformation. Rumors shifted from ridicule to wonder. Some said the rancher had been bewitched. Others whispered of a strange, unbreakable bond. But John and Aylin paid no mind. They rose with the dawn, worked side by side, and ended each day in the warmth of one another's company. For them, the world outside mattered little. Their lives were written not in gossip, but in the rhythm of labor, laughter, and love. On a cool autumn evening, as the horizon blazed gold, John sat with Aylin on the porch. The wind carried the scent of harvested fields, and the sky stretched wide with promise. He looked at her, the woman who had come barefoot to his gate, trembling yet unbroken, and marveled at how much his world had changed. She had asked only for a place to stay, but she had given him far more: laughter, strength, and a love that even the wild frontier could not silence. And as the stars bloomed overhead, John knew his lonely days had ended forever.